Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again for the second part of our conference on the United Nations and cultural diplomacy. It's an honor that we have the chance also to welcome you here today at the Bulgarian Embassy. I must say our first speaker was initially going to be our host and was very generous actually in offering to host us at the UNDP. Unfortunately, we outgrew the UNDP where we only actually had the chance to have up to 40 participants. And so I think today will be at least 60 or 70. So I'm grateful to actually have our host, who will meet later today, Ambassador Poptorova, the Ambassador of Bulgaria to the United States, a good partner of ours. So in her absence, I would just say thank you for her kind generosity. We'll have the chance to meet her for a keynote address later today, but I'm really happy that we can be here in the Bulgarian Embassy. I'll say a few more words about Bulgaria later today. But now I'm actually really happy to have William Davis here. I had the chance to meet William about a year and a half ago when he gave one of the best lectures, actually, of our conference in Washington.
Only one of the best?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not coming back again.
I'm trying to keep it moderate because some of the other speakers
You're very diplomatic. Good job.
But it was great and really excellent feedback. So I think, first of all, I'm very happy to have you back just to hear your lecture again. I think you really inspired, and really one of the areas where, William, you can really see his passion is in terms of really, let's say, expressing the United Nations. I think your heart is really United Nations inside and out, and I think you'll see that very quickly.
He went blue tie today.
In his new position in the UNDP, as well as previously, he was working for the United Nations Information Center. But let me say a few words about his background, just so you can get a sense for the vast array of experiences that he's bringing with him in his current position at the UNDP. He's currently the director of the Washington office of the United Nations Development Program. He has also served in the UN as director for the United Nations Information Center, and it was in that capacity that we first got to know each other. In addition, Mr. Davis has held a number of senior positions, including Director of the Global and Functional Affairs in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs at the State Department, Deputy Head of the Public Affairs Division of the OECD, and Director at the National Security Council staff. Mr. Davis was educated at Duke University with degrees in public policy and political science, and spent his early career at the Executive Office of the President and the U.S. Department of Treasury. Please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Mr. William Davis.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to stand up because this way I can see you if you fall asleep in the back and move around a little bit. It's terrible to have you trapped inside today on such a gorgeous day, but I will try to keep this as painless as possible. It's a pleasure to be back to speak to the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. I was impressed by the last group that I spoke to and know that I will be equally impressed by the group here today. My goal over the next 20 minutes or so is to try to give you a sense for some of the priorities that the UN is looking towards in 2012. And I know you were all up in New York for the last couple days, right? So you're all UN experts, correct? There's a laugh. You haven't mastered the United Nations yet? Oh, this is going to be fun. All right. Then I think what I'm going to do is, since you are all acknowledged UN experts, is put you to work first. And after your 2 days up at New York headquarters, and through your vast experience in your personal lives, I'm going to put the burden on you for a minute. Tell me what comes to mind when you think of the United Nations. Just what pops into your head? Lazy? Corruption? No, stop. Is this on? Okay. No, what comes to mind when you think about the United Nations? And you have a global perspective. One or two words. What?
Humanitarianism.
Thank you. Humanitarianism, right at the core of what we do, and one of the issues that I'm going to talk about in our priorities. Absolutely. Whenever there's a crisis, the UN is the global first responder. Yes? Peace. Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, through peacekeeping, this is one of the largest industries. You never see the words peacekeeping written in the United Nations Charter, yet it has turned into one of the biggest products that our member states ask of the United Nations these days. I'll cover that a little bit in my talk as well. Good answers. What else? Soft power. We have 120,000 peacekeepers with guns out in the field. But yes, it is very soft power, absolutely. Rarely can the United Nations impose its will on an individual member state, particularly larger or more powerful member states. It has to be through consensus and with the mandate of the international community. So it is very much soft power because of the range of things that we deal with as well. Good answers. What about over here? You guys didn't go to New York or you slept through all the meetings? No. Yes, please.
International security.
International security, absolutely. Whether it be through peacekeeping, whether it be through our preventive diplomacy efforts, whether it be through civilian police or trying to increase the judicial capacity of our member states that need help in that area. A lot of focus on peace and security. Those are all good answers. How about my boss? Well, actually, yeah, I should put on my new hat. My former boss, and in fact, he's the boss of the whole thing, and I just gave it away that it's a he, who's our Secretary General? Ban Ki-moon. And for extra credit, do you know where he's from? South Korea, exactly. He's certainly one of the most visible aspects of the United Nations. You think of the Secretary General, you think of, well, as some Secretary Generals have been called, a secular pope. You definitely see him as the world's chief diplomat. Unfortunately, I have to say him because we have yet to have the pleasure of a female Secretary General. One would hope that that will change in the not too distant future. Maybe one of you sitting in the room. So yes, of course you think of the Secretary General. You think of the Security Council, 15 members. How many permanent members on the Security Council? Did you learn that up in New York? 5, exactly. The P5, Russia, China, France, US, United Kingdom. With extraordinary powers. They all have not only the luxury of never having to run for election on the Security Council, they also get the veto, right? Any one of those P5, if they don't like something, it doesn't happen. So for you Americans in the room, there are some here in the United States that think, well, maybe the United Nations is anti-American, or the United Nations is trying to tell the United States what to do. You know, in our dreams, maybe, but no, absolutely not. The United Nations is nowhere near being a world government that can impose its will on its member states, certainly not on a country as large and influential as the United States. So you think of the Security Council, think of the Economic and Social Council, the General Assembly, all, how many members? How many members of the United Nations? Oh, too bad. I was all ready to give you a charter. 193 members, exactly. Oh, here's a good one then. This will be for the charter. Who's our newest member? Raise, oh, you all know this. I'll get a tough one for you, and that'll allow me to bestow a copy of the charter on somebody at some point. Yes, 193 countries, with the Republic of South Sudan being the newest member of the United Nations, just having come into being over the course of this last summer. So there you have 193 members in the General Assembly, one country, one vote. Not necessarily a very fun environment for large countries like the United States. You know, if you're sitting there next to Andorra or Liechtenstein, I hope I'm not picking on anybody from Andorra. You know, they have the same voting power as the United States. Not exactly the environment where you want to take weighty decisions if you're one of the superpowers. So much of that will gravitate to the Security Council. And then you've got the entire UN system. Because it really is a system, right? It's not one thing. Look at me. I work for now the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, the arm of the UN system that is charged with promoting sustainable development amongst our member states, working on issues like environmental protection, good governance, response to crises and natural disasters. And we work in partnership with all the other parts of the United Nations. You've got, well, let's try to quiz you, see how much you learned up in New York. What other parts, funds, programs, or agencies have you heard of from the United Nations? UNESCO, a very interesting part of the UN if you're talking from the United States perspective at the moment. UNESCO has just welcomed a new member, which is Palestine's, exactly, which has caused an automatic funding cutoff by the United States. Because of any UN entity that has the Palestinians as a member, there's US legislation that says the US cannot contribute to that entity. So you've got UNESCO. Who else is out there? UN Women. You definitely get it. Charge. I was going to get to UN Women, and I'm so glad you raised it. They are the newest part of the United Nations. Oh, run by, who's the head of UN Women? Michelle Bachelet from Chile, an extraordinary woman, former president of Chile, former not only Minister of Health, but Minister of Defense, one of the first women, if not the first women, ministers of defense from a Latin American country. And she has now decided to bring her talents to New York to head the new UN Women Agency, which is charged with advancing women's rights, gender rights, and infusing that throughout the work of the entire United Nations. Thank you for bringing up UN Women. Other parts of, you haven't gotten to my favorite children's organization. Everybody knows. UNICEF, exactly. Do you Americans, do you ever go trick-or-treating for UNICEF? Does that still exist with the little boxes? Yes, thank you. Absolutely.
In Canada, too.
In Canada, too? They trick-or-treat in Canada?
Yeah.
Great. Such a country, you know, so very exotic up there. We never figured out Canada. Well, UNICEF, absolutely. UNICEF is responsible for achievements like vaccinating 40% of the world's children against transmittable diseases. You've also got the other humanitarian actors in the United Nations system, the UN World Food Program, which provides food to 80 million people plus a year that otherwise would go to bed hungry tonight. Or the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Angelina Jolie. You know, often I say that and there is nobody that giggles in the room. Seeing as how you are all UN experts, I have to confess, Angelina Jolie is not our High Commissioner for Refugees. She is, however, a very effective UN goodwill ambassador for the cause of refugees around the planet, using her celebrity status to draw some of the paparazzi spotlight to the plight of the dispossessed. Now, our UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres from Portugal, any Portuguese? No. From Portugal, has been running UNHCR for a number of years. They are responsible with providing shelter and support to the, I think now, roughly 25 million people that have been displaced or uprooted due to conflict or natural disaster. So this is a part of the UN that I think, particularly for, speaking as an American, us Americans, we just don't see. You don't see UNICEF vaccinating kids in Miami. You don't see WFP distributing food in Kansas. You don't see UNHCR putting up refugee camps outside of Sacramento. What you see in the United States, I think, is a lot of what I'm doing. They tend to have a perception that the UN is nothing but a talk shop. But in fact, the UN has changed dramatically from when it was created 60 plus years ago, when we had roughly 50 members, to now more than 193 members and a presence on the ground in just about every country on the planet. Now the majority of our staff are based in what we call the field instead of our headquarters. And even our headquarters could be confusing, because you were just at UN headquarters, right? Then what have we got in Geneva, where we've got headquarters for the UN High Commissioner for Refugee, and headquarters for the World Health Organization, and headquarters for the International Labor Organization. We've got a lot of headquarters in Geneva, a lot of headquarters in Vienna, Austria. 2 of our UN agencies are headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. So we're scattered all over the planet when it comes to headquarters as well. Not an easy thing to kind of get your head around, the United Nations. But I guarantee you, over the next 20 minutes, you'll leave here, in addition to your time in New York, all experts on the UN. All right, with that as an introduction, let me try to, yes?
No one used the words human rights.
Look what I have here.
I probably have a few.
Do you have a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
I teach it.
You teach it? I'll hold on to it. Nobody mentioned human rights, and I'm so grateful that somebody did. As one of the pillars upon which the United Nations was founded, sustainable development and combating poverty and want, peace and security, and promoting human rights. Human rights is at the core of so much of what we do, and in fact, I did mention our UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is based in Geneva, and one of the more active and now even field-based presences of the UN system. So, thank you. I think what I'll try to do is look at some of the priorities for the UN to focus on over the course of the year, as enunciated by our Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, and then maybe touch on a few of the common challenges and priorities, leaving enough time also for us to get into Q&A. One last point, I think, maybe in my introductory thoughts, is after having been up there in New York and having seen it in action, it's also difficult to get your head around the UN, because is the UN a stage where our member states come together and we just turn the lights on and give them water to drink? Or is the UN an actor as well? By now you know the answer to this question, right? It's both. Obviously, we are a forum in which all of our member states come together to try to hash out resolutions to the common challenges that we face. But the UN, when it's doing the humanitarian things that I just outlined, or putting peacekeepers in the field, can also be a very robust actor on the international stage as well. It never fails, though. When something goes wrong, the member states will usually point to the UN as having screwed it up, or we'll turn right around and say, well, you know, we can't do anything about that. That's a member state issue. So there's always some of the finger pointing back and forth. But in truth, the UN is this weird amalgamation now of more than just a conference center. Because our member states have asked us to do so much, we're now a very aggressive actor in a number of fields as well, once we're given the mandate and the resources to carry out those mandates. All right, so what are some of these mandates? And that can be your word for the day, mandate. Because we really don't do anything at the United Nations unless we're given a mandate by our member states. Certainly, the Secretary General can't just decide to send a peacekeeping mission somewhere on his own and wave a wand and have it materialize. We have to get a mandate via a resolution from the Security Council. And it's the Security Council resolutions that define what our peacekeeping missions can do, or the decisions of the General Assembly that provide the budget for all aspects of the Secretariat, that give us our priorities. So the UN is, again, not just some type of independent spaceship out there in outer space doing whatever it feels like. We are very much driven entirely by the wishes and priorities of our member states as they come together and set those priorities. Common challenge and priority number one. The Secretary General outlined it as prevention, and here's where I can get into a little bit of a discussion on peacekeeping. Obviously, it makes more sense for us to try to prevent a disaster from happening before it happens. Unfortunately, I think the standard operating procedure for most of the international community and most institutions in general is to respond. But if we can get ahead of that curve, if we can prevent conflicts from breaking out before the need to send in peacekeepers, then we can have a lot more success in what we're trying to do. And we've recently developed a more robust preventive diplomacy capacity in our Department of Political Affairs. We kind of have a SWAT team of negotiators that know how to go into conflict areas and try to diffuse the situation. There was post-election violence not too many years ago in Kenya, with a lot of ethnic differences, and a country that many had viewed as one of the most stable in Africa, threatening to explode into countrywide conflict. But the UN was able to go in very quietly with the assistance of our former Secretary General, Kofi Annan, as kind of the lead negotiator, and try to knit together some type of power-sharing arrangement that, for the moment, has prevented conflict from spreading more widely in Kenya. We're trying to do initiatives like that in countries all around the planet where it looks like the UN's negotiating skills can bring some value added to the table. And we also have peacekeeping. When countries have agreed that their problems are not going to be solved at the end of a gun, and that they want to give peace a chance, then UN peacekeeping can be a very effective tool to try to provide the space for that peace to take root. And let me emphasize again that, because I hear this a lot when I go around and give talks, that it really is peacekeeping, all right? It's not peacemaking. When countries agree that they want to stop fighting, that's when UN peacekeeping is most effective. And here, let me give you a little peek behind the curtain of UN peacekeeping. The United Nations currently has the second largest deployed military force on the planet. Always makes Americans nervous. But 120,000 blue-helmeted peacekeepers are now in 16 different peacekeeping missions around the world, the most ever in the history of the organization. And again, this is not our decision. This is at the behest of our member states. But where do we get those troops from? We have our UN standing army, right? No. From where? Member states, precisely. As soon as our friends in the Security Council provide a resolution giving us a mandate for the creation of a peacekeeping force, first thing the Secretary General or his representatives in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations do is pick up the phone. Say, anybody want to give us troops to go into Darfur? Sometimes the response is generous and rapid. Other times, less generous and less rapid. We can only work with the tools that are given to us. And here's where I usually stump people. And for the smart ones in the audience, I'm going to bestow upon you our latest peacekeeping year in review that has all of the key statistics in the back. So for example, when the call goes out to create a peacekeeping mission, we call our member states. Which countries are our leading troop contributors? Can you name some of the... Where are you from, sir?
Azerbaijan.
Azerbaijan. Yet you knew Pakistan is one of our top 10 troop contributors.
One of my spheres, strategic security, Czech Republic.
Ah, well, you probably already have a copy of that as well. But yes, Pakistan. Who else? Who are our big troop contributors? India. You guys are letting me down. Nobody's going to say United States? No, you're far too smart. I said 120,000 peacekeepers out there. 87, I think, is the number in the back of that book from the United States. 87, period. Not 87,000, 87. Yet you go around the United States, as I used to do, giving talks to college groups or to chambers of commerce or Rotary clubs. They're convinced that the United States is one of the big troop contributors. Even our friends in Canada have kind of slid down the scale. I don't know if they're still... Canadians almost invented peacekeeping. It was wonderfully supported by Canada. But now our top troop contributing countries are countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Jordan, Ghana, Senegal. Romania hasn't quite cracked the top 10, but I think they are very generous contributors. Creeping up on the top 10 is China, one of the few permanent members of the Security Council. From China, mainland China, absolutely. I visited Chinese peacekeeping combat engineers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
I have a question about that.
Yeah?
Is there an independent source of funding for the UN Army? Because I know that UN has a very efficient allocation of the funds.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, because I'm hoping to save some questions for the end. Let's keep our Q&As from now on to the end, but I will address that. We get our funding from you. Thank you. Peacekeeping is assessed. Once a peacekeeping mission is created by the Security Council, we propose what the budget will be. The member states approve that, and then we send out the bills. And okay, I was ragging on the United States a few minutes ago for not contributing so much to peacekeeping in terms of soldiers. Number one payer for UN peacekeeping missions at 27% of the cost of our peacekeeping, the United States. Again, it's through a formula largely driven by size of your economy, but also based on whether you're one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, that the formula is determined as to who pays for UN peacekeeping. So U.S. is up there at number 1. Japan and Germany are, I think, 2 and 3 respectively. Then most of the countries of Western Europe are amongst the top contributors to UN peacekeeping as well, financially. So our funding for UN peacekeeping is part of our assessed contributions. And this is worth actually pausing for a moment because my salary used to be paid through assessments. 22% of my salary would come from the United States. Thank you, United States. Roughly, I think, 13% from Japan, 8 or 9% from Germany, and then it would trickle on down to smaller and smaller and smaller amounts. Those were assessed contributions for the Secretariat. Everybody has agreed that these bills should be paid. For the UN to exist, to become a member of the UN, you're willing to pay your fair share. However, in my new hat with the United Nations Development Program, nobody has to give us a penny if they don't want to. Entirely voluntarily funded. Again, I think a lot of people have the perception that the United Nations is just one big fat entitlement. But no, the majority of the funding that goes into the UN system now, if you exclude peacekeeping, which is a big chunk of change, is voluntarily funded. Our friends at UNICEF, again, nobody has to give them a penny unless they're doing a job that people find valuable. Same for the World Food Program. Same for the High Commissioner for Refugees. So many of these programs are voluntarily funded because they do jobs that our member states find valuable. So that's a useful impression to remember. All right, so I talked a little bit about the challenge of prevention and peace and security. Let's talk about sustainable development. One very near and dear to my heart now at the United Nations Development Program. This is going to be a big year on the development landscape because we're going to have the 20th anniversary summit of the Rio Earth Summit in June of this year. World leaders will descend upon Rio de Janeiro and they will try to craft out a program to approach sustainable development on a global basis for who knows how many coming years. We're also looking at seeing the end of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, which were kicked off, appropriately enough, in 2000, with an end date of 2015. We've made incredible progress towards meeting the MDGs, but not every country right now is on track to meet all, anybody know how many Millennium Development Goals there are? 8. Wow. I was going to save this for the big grand finale, but in fact, you've earned it. Hopefully you don't have to fly with that in your suitcase. It'll weigh you down. But absolutely. 8 Millennium Development Goals, agreed upon by world leaders back in 2000 as the global consensus on the best way to combat poverty, to promote universal access to primary education, on the best way to advance women's rights, as the best way to combat maternal mortality and child mortality. And like I said, there has been some extraordinary progress, particularly thanks to the rise of China and India, on having the number of people that are living in extreme poverty. But we're still not on track to meet universally the Millennium Development Goals by 2015. So our leaders have to gather again in Rio this coming June to figure out what the post-Millennium Development Goal architecture is going to look like. We also focus on a number of issues like aid effectiveness. A lot of my colleagues just came back from a meeting in Busan, South Korea, to make sure that when countries give foreign aid, that it actually has the impact that it's supposed to. Nobody's rolling in money anymore these days. The global economic downturn has affected everyone, particularly a lot of the Western donors. They want to make sure that the money they give to us for development assistance goes to the people who need it, and that it has an impact. So aid effectiveness has become a huge priority. Similarly, good governance. You can have all the best intentions and the best projects in the world, but if you don't have a partner that you trust, that is using the money for the intended purposes, all too often you see it frittered away. So we've focused intensively on building up the governance capacity of our member states, both donors and recipients, so that aid can be tracked and effectiveness can be maximized. We're also focusing on a safer, more secure world for countries in conflict. We're looking at areas where we do have peacekeeping missions and those where we don't. States like Afghanistan and Iraq that are still racked by violence, where the UN has large special political missions, particularly in Afghanistan, in support of the international NATO alliance that is in Afghanistan, and where the UN is doing so much of the work to try to boost up the civilian role there. Another priority, number 4, is to support nations in transition, particularly countries like those in the Arab Spring. Seems strange to call it spring still a year later, but nonetheless, the Arab uprising, where the UN can go in and help with elections, go in and help with political participation that is inclusive, help with developing governments so that they can provide the services that their citizens want and expect after this euphoric outreach that has taken place. And the final of the 5 priorities that the Secretary General has outlined for 2012 is to focus on women and young people. With UN Women, again, I think the UN system has taken a significant step forward to mainstream gender rights in all of the UN's work. But in addition, why did we see such an uprising amongst the Arab countries? A big contributor is the fact that you've got a younger generation that's feeling disenfranchised, that doesn't feel like they have access to the opportunities to participate fairly in the system. So focusing on youth, not only at their youngest, like our colleagues do at UNICEF, and making sure that they can get education if they desire it, but also for young folks working for opportunities in our nation's economic systems. All right, those are your 5 priorities. And able to accomplish all these, of course, it should almost go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway, the UN has got to reform in order to carry out the charges that our member states have asked of us. So our Secretary General and throughout the UN system has placed a greater priority on UN effectiveness, UN transparency, UN accountability. So now we have financial disclosure forms that are as rigorous as anything that I filled out when I worked at the State Department. We have ethics offices that can train us to stay away from difficult ethical entanglements and also advise us on ethical situations that turn out to be difficult. We've got inspector generals that are now empowered and overseeing the work of the UN system to a greater degree, and we're placing more and more of that information on the internet, whether it be our audits of our internal operations or even our financial information. So the UN is trying to live up to the language that we're preaching to all of our member states. Let me close then by touching on what you're doing here at this conference, and that's cultural diplomacy, which is so much at the heart of what the United Nations does and is about. Because the United Nations is both a promoter of cultural diplomacy and an embodiment Again, an actor and a stage. Through our work promoting good governance, through our work of the Alliance of Civilizations, trying to build bridges between West and East, trying to build bridges between Muslim and Christian worlds, trying to promote better understanding, through UNESCO's work in support of journalist rights and access to education and scientific sharing of scientific information and data, through our goodwill ambassadors, Angelina Jolie, other members from media or from academia or from the sports world that are out there trying to promote an awareness and support for many of the initiatives coming out of the United Nations. The UN is all about cultural diplomacy. And we embody it. Because you were just up there at UN headquarters. It really is kind of inspirational, right? Thank you. You're nodding. It is kind of inspirational. I think so. I grew up in Ohio, which, you know, isn't a very exciting place. But to go to New York City and see people from all over the world working together on common challenges, whether it be combating proliferation or hunger or poverty or counterterrorism or climate change, it really does kind of stir the soul to see people coming from such a diverse array of countries. Look at this room as well, to try to address these issues that are beyond the capability of any one country to address by themselves, even if that country is a superpower. That's what the United Nations is about. All right, I've used up a big chunk of the time, so I promise to stick around for as long as you can have me to answer any particular questions that you have. I skirted over a lot, left out a lot, but if there's something that either I touched on or neglected, please don't be shy. Who wants to be our first brave questioner? Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Ellie Richard.
Yes.
From Greensboro, North Carolina.
Greensboro, North Carolina.
You're a Duke guy.
I am a Duke guy. I was just down in beautiful Asheville.
Oh, I
Yeah.
just moved from Asheville.
Well, there you go. So you're going to ask me an easy question, right? Thank you.
Easy question. It has to do with prevention.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Department of Political Affairs.
Yes.
And I'm just hoping you could elaborate on what the department's doing. I know you mentioned negotiation.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if they have some kind of strategy for locating hotspots, you know, where things are brewing.
We do.
If you could speak to that, that'd be great.
We do. It's an odd dynamic because we have a number of parts of the UN that do look at hotspots. We have a special advisor for the prevention of genocide, whose job it is to try to kind of keep a finger to the wind to see when it looks like a situation might be arising that we could then go help a member state in dealing with. And that's the way we try to present it. Although he's a superb guy, Francis Deng from Sudan, he says, nobody ever wants me to come visit their country. You know, it's like the angel of death when the special advisor on the prevention of genocide gets off the airplane at your airport. Nobody wants to see that in their country. But in fact, the UN does have a lot of tools that we can bring to bear, whether it is advising on inclusive political processes or in support for democratic elections, or whether it's just trying to mediate in conflicts between different groups. The UN has got a lot of experience, a lot of trained negotiators, and we don't even necessarily need to be the ones grabbing the headlines. We can come in kind of quietly behind the scenes and try to support those that do want to reach some type of peace through non-violent methods. It's still that old adage, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Nobody wants to pay for the prevention. And it doesn't make headlines to go in and stop a conflict from blowing up. Nobody reads in the newspaper about the dog that didn't bark or the planes that land safely. They read about the crashes or the wars. So it's hard to get our member states with all of the things on their agendas to focus on something like prevention and investing in preventive diplomacy. But slowly we're starting to do that. Slowly we're starting to do that. So that is a good question.
Access additional information?
Oh, tons of it. Tons of it.
You mentioned the 5 priorities for UNDP in New York, but obviously the agenda for Washington is very different than in New York. And I'm just kind of curious to know what you're focusing on with your new role here.
Sure, sure. Obviously, the Rio Summit is going to be a huge priority for the U.S. government because it is so broad. You know, sustainable development is not just environment. Sustainable development is also things like access to energy or maternal and child health or good governance and sustainable political systems. So many different aspects of the U.S. government are interested in the upcoming Rio Summit, that sometimes it's hard to get a coherent voice out of the U.S. government. Fortunately, our good friends at the White House and the National Security Council staff have now got their hands around all the various aspects of the U.S. government that are going to have interests at play down in Rio. And the U.S. is starting to focus on what it is that they want to try to achieve out of that conference. It's a tough one as well, speaking quite honestly, just for the record of our friends around the world. It's quite a difficult political one as well for the United States, because there's almost a lose-lose proposition. If you go in with a huge investment in sustainable development, as the rest of the world would love to see out of the United States, we've still got a lot of people suffering in the current economy that aren't excited about huge international expenditures. So during a presidential election year, that's a heavy lift. Conversely, if you go down there with a very modest agenda and just kind of want to get out with your head intact, you're going to see a lot of disappointment around the planet. So I don't admire the U.S. government and our friends in the Congress that are grappling with these issues, because particularly during an election year, this is a tough balance that they're going to have to strike. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Liz Kelly from Canada.
Yes.
I'm here in my role as president-elect of my Rotary Club.
Rotary! I love Rotary!
Well, that's my question.
Yes!
Is, as much as the UNDP, it seems very governmental, do you partner with NGOs and with other organizations?
You all are making my job much easier. Everything that I should have said, you're bringing out during the questions. Absolutely. In fact, I think a lot of credit has to go to our previous Secretary General, Kofi Annan, on realizing that there's only so much, frankly, that the world can do anymore by even governments just sitting down together and talking. There is so much initiative coming out of the private sector, out of civil society, non-governmental organizations, academic institutions, that it's no longer sufficient for us to just have government types sitting in a room talking to each other. You look at actors now on the stage like the Gates Foundation, bringing immense resources to bear, having huge impact. It would be silly for us to say, oh, well, that's not a government. We don't deal with them. So yes, increasingly we are opening ourselves up to working with civil society, with the business community that, again, I don't know how many times I've heard it over and over again, governments can't create development. It's the private sector that drives investment and job creation and development. So that if we don't work with non-governmental players, we're leaving out half of the folks that can have an impact. And Rotary, in fact, has a special spot in the UN firmament, and in your heart. That's great. In mine as well, because Rotary was there at the creation of the United Nations. When the convention, the International Convention in San Francisco, was drawn together in the summer of 1945 to draft, who did I give my UN Charter to? To draft my UN Charter, they invited Rotarians to come advise them on how to create an international organization. So there were Rotarians present at the birth of the UN in San Francisco. So great partners and great work on polio eradication.
So close.
Oh, you'll get there. You'll get there. And we want to support every way we can. All right, I saw some hands back there. Yes? Yes. I had this conversation with somebody yesterday. The question, for those that may not have heard it, is particularly when the UN goes in, or any international donor goes in with a large relief organization, or even sometimes with our very heavy development presence, then we're sometimes, and perhaps unintentionally, doing more harm than good. You can distort local markets by bringing in massive amounts of agricultural products. You can distort local development efforts if all you do is hire, for the Washingtonians, beltway bandits, international contractors to come in with their technical advisors to sit there in expensive hotels and then come back out a few months later and say, well, you didn't do what we told you to do. So there are lots of ways that I think the international development community, and I know our colleagues at USAID are taking the lead on this, in working on country-owned approaches to development. You really have to see from our local partners what it is they need, because they know better than us flying in on some airplane. They also are the ones that are going to have to do it if international resources dry up. And we ultimately, the goal of development is to put ourselves out of business. The old adage again, teach a man how to fish instead of giving him a fish. We want the developing countries that we work with, that we partner with, to be able to sustain development ultimately on their own without the need of the international community to come in with our heavy, cumbersome hand at times. So very much one of the buzzwords you hear in development these days is country-owned approaches. You're exactly right. Yes, please.
I want you to enlighten me on this point.
Mm-hmm.
United Nations, for instance, their role on women in developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
Remember sometime about 2 or 3 years ago, I got, can I call it a contract or subcontract? I didn't know from where, but I knew it was from United Nations. Somebody who worked there or who had a concern, this could you translate a document on national gender policy. It's a United Nations document into Igbo. I teach Igbo language, Igbo culture, and Igbo literature at the university.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, okay, I did the translation and I was paid.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never seen it used anywhere. You know, I didn't know what I did it for, because I knew that if I did the translation from English language to the language, it was supposed to be accessible to the language speaker. But I've never seen it anywhere, and I don't know. What do I do with it?
Good point. I've stood up here for a better part of an hour painting a wonderfully rosy or wonderful UN bluey portrait of the United Nations. We are far from perfect, far from perfect. Just as in describing peacekeeping, when you try to get troops from countries all over the planet, ship them a couple thousand miles into a country most of them have never visited before, speaking a language that none of them speak, and expect them to instantly produce a stable country, it doesn't work. Similarly, yes, it's inspiring to go to United Nations headquarters and see people from around the world working together. Sometimes it doesn't always work very well, which is why our Secretary General has placed such a premium on UN reform, to make our human resource system work better, to make sure that we partner better with other actors that are not governmental outside of the in the non-governmental sphere, to make sure that we're more transparent, so that when you do a piece of work for the United Nations, you at least know what it's going to go do. This is, however, a very slow process. We are not the world's perfect organization. We never will be, because we're so complex and we work in so many difficult areas. So for every example that I give you of something wonderful that we've done, there will be some shortcoming that we need to continue to try to work on better. And maybe one more question, because I think you're next.
Yes.
Or, yeah.
We'll have,
How are you?
I'm good.
we'll just have one more question.
All right, so
you can do the honors.
all right, since I already rewarded you with a peacekeeping thing, I'm going to go in the back, and then I can talk to you afterwards. Yeah.
Under what circumstances is necessary to create new programs for the UN, and under what circumstances is it required to abandon old programs for the UN?
You're good. You're good. Often it's required to create new programs. I've touched on a few. Just the majority of our member states all agree are priority activities. We've seen, like I said, a big ramping up of our special political mission in Afghanistan, lots of work on disaster prevention, lots of work on response to the humanitarian crises, because that's, again, a role that largely the UN is only the only one suited to fill. But if somebody could get in there with a pair of pruning scissors and go after some of these old mandates that I think, frankly, many of which have got to be outdated, it would only benefit the organization, because in an era of scarce resources, you have to do that. The challenge is getting all 193 of our member states to agree on which of those 9,000 are outdated. Everybody's got their own pet rock. So it's very tricky. But that's a very good question, very good question. All right, I think I've taken up a big chunk of your time. Let me express my gratitude for your willingness to listen to me talk about the United Nations. Let me express my admiration for the fact that you're willing to devote your time and energy and intellect to looking at these issues. And let me urge you to keep engaged. We desperately need people that are citizens of your countries, absolutely, but also citizens that think globally. Because so many of the issues that we tackle can only be done if you're working together. And the UN can be a great way to try to tackle many of those, I would humbly submit. All right, thanks for your time today. Thank you.